Good morning, welcome, and thank you for tuning in for this conversation with Bill Braniff, Executive Director of PERIL, which is the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab in the School of Public Affairs at American University. Bill, it's a real pleasure to see you again. I'd like to talk to you for about 45 minutes about a range of topics of interest to readers of terrorism and political violence. Let's begin with a quick look at some milestones along your journey to this point. After graduating from high school in 1995, you attended West Point. Was terrorism or counterterrorism a topic of discussion in any of the classes you had during that period of time?
No, no, not really. Especially because West Point is primarily an engineering school, so lots of math, lots of science. Um, and I chose to be an English major. I really thought I was going to teach high school English and coach a cross-country team when I got out of the Army. So no, this was not a particularly specific topic of study at West Point, which was more interested in conventional war in terms of the military history classes that we took, and wasn't a personal interest of mine at the time.
Hmm. And then you graduated in 1999 and you joined the U.S. Army. So you were active duty military on 9/11. Can you talk about your experiences during that period of time?
I can. That was the first day on the job as a new scout platoon leader. So I had been in my battalion for 2 years. The first year as a tank platoon leader, I went to Kosovo as a peacekeeper. Second year, I was a tank executive officer, so the second in command of a tank company. And then the third year, the scout platoon leader, which is a really coveted position in an armor battalion. But I took a week off because I was about to start this new gig within the battalion, and 9/11 was basically the first day of my vacation. And I was sightseeing in Germany with a friend, had no idea what had happened because of the time difference in part and because we were out and about. And I got back to my apartment in the evening and I saw one of the guys in my battalion throwing all of his gear in the back of his Jeep. And I said, "Hey man, what's going on?" And he looked at me like, I was the last human on the planet not to know. And he told me, and I dropped my friend off at another friend's house, threw all my gear in the back of my Jeep and went to work and stayed at work for the next week, securing the facility, the little post that we were stationed at. My scout platoon, pulled perimeter security, and yeah, we were off to the races.
In any fond memories or not so fond memories of those last few years in the military?
You know, I think it's important for those, especially of your readers who might be a little bit younger. Um, when I showed up that day, 9/11, and met my scout platoon really for the first time, this hard-nosed non-commissioned officer sort of looked me up and down like this is my new platoon leader, and he said, "Hey, sir, are we going to war?" And I said, "Yes. I just don't know where." The level of strategic surprise. Um, sure, there were people at Alex Station, FBI, CIA folks on the Bin Laden team that were aware of what had happened and why. I was not. I had no idea what had happened, and I was not alone. The strategic surprise and frankly the cluelessness that I had as a conventional Army guy, at that period of time, is hard to convey now after that sort of, you know, history changing moment. And I want to be very clear, I did not wind up deploying to Iraq or Afghanistan. So I'm not a combat veteran, but my battalion did deploy. They got their deployment orders about a week after I had cycled out of my post in Germany and went back to Fort Knox, Kentucky. I think that, the overarching memory I have was knowing that things were fundamentally different, but just needing to understand how and why. I mean, I got out of the military to go to grad school to figure it out, like what happened, on 9/11. But let me just give you a quick anecdote to sort of reinforce this point about the newness. And I know it's not a new phenomenon historically, but in our national security psyche, the newness of terrorism. I was a peacekeeper in Kosovo, as I mentioned, and one afternoon, an individual walked out of his front door and was shot in the shoulder with an AK-47 round. And my tank platoon was charged with, becoming the detectives to figure out why this individual had gotten shot. And having seen television shows about detectives, I knew that I had to ask questions about this individual's background and figure out, who he had screwed over, frankly. Maybe during the war, he had done terrible things between Albanians and Serbs. Maybe post-war, he had kept the kerosene and the flour for his people and didn't give it to the other ethnic group. I could not find a single derogatory bit of information about this individual. He was a stand-up guy. And I just couldn't figure it out. Nothing made any sense. I come from the United States where we have an individual punitive system of government. Individuals commit crimes. They're responsible for those crimes. They did something wrong. And I had this sort of mindset subconsciously. About a month and a half later, I was on a presence patrol asking an entirely different set of questions about those who'd been ethnically cleansed and whether or not they were thinking about repatriating. And an elderly woman looked at me like, well, that's a dumb question. Of course, no one's thinking about repatriating. And I said, well, I mean, it's very, very safe here now. There's next to no violence. Like, why are people still afraid to come home? And she looked at me and she said, because Draganovich got shot. And it finally clicked in my head that Draganovich getting shot had nothing to do with Draganovich. Draganovich getting shot had to do with the fact that he was a symbolic target for every other Serb who had been, displaced, not to come home yet because it wasn't safe for them. They were the target audience, not the individual who'd been almost assassinated. And that was like mind-blowing for me at the time. The idea that there was this symbolic violence that was intended to have an audience beyond the physical target of the attack as a form of political communication. I mean, now it's like, well, we've been doing this now for a very long time, James, but it was like a eureka moment for me. And then for that to happen, and then 9/11 to happen, a year later, I just had to figure out this terrorism studies stuff.
Okay, fair enough. So you went off to Johns Hopkins University to try and figure this out. Did they have courses on terrorism, counterterrorism at Johns Hopkins?
Not at the time, not nearly satisfactorily enough, for what I was hoping for. But they had wonderful courses. Don't get me wrong, but terrorism studies wasn't really yet a thing in the way that it is now. And I know many of us, many of your readers will know that, but the scientific study of terrorism really wasn't occurring. There were incredible political scientists and historians, Bruce Hoffman and Martha Crenshaw, several others who were really doing pioneering work, but it wasn't mainstream. And much of the work was case study driven, right? So if you wanted to read all about the FARC, you could read all about the FARC. But if you were trying to take that information and figure out how to allocate resources across the continental United States, the case study on the FARC just isn't going to do a whole lot for you because there wasn't the same systematic study of terrorism as we have today. So I took some really fascinating classes on insurgency, on human propensity towards violence, and all of these things were informative. But really, it wasn't until two experiences later, going to work at the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point, where I got my education on terrorism and counterterrorism for real.
Yeah, let's talk about that. So you returned to West Point in 2007 after graduating Johns Hopkins, and you joined the Combating Terrorism Center as the Director of Practitioner Education. And you were charged with developing a long-running series of terrorism and counterterrorism education seminars, which you delivered at Joint Terrorism Task Forces. You helped the FBI revise its curriculum. It's a new agent training program at Quantico. Can you tell us how that all got started and how it progressed?
Uh, sure. It all began at an Army football tailgate. At the time, when I graduated from the International Relations program at Johns Hopkins, I got a fellowship at the National Nuclear Security Administration. So I was working for this semi-autonomous body of the Department of Energy, doing nuclear counterterrorism, but doctrinally it was actually anti-terrorism, meaning we were working with former Soviet Union countries to try to make it more difficult for fissile material to either wind up on the black market or in the back of a Chechen vehicle en route to some sort of dirty bomb, right? So it was really anti-terrorism hardening targets. And it was incredible work. As somebody who'd been in the Army and indoctrinated that was the only way to serve, it was incredible to meet, bilingual nuclear physicists who spent their time going back and forth to Siberia to secure nuclear weapons. You're like, okay, there are a lot of ways to serve out there that I didn't even know existed, right? And these were amazing humans. Wasn't for me in the long run. It was really cool work, but I started to do a little bit of consulting for the Combating Terrorism Center, doing some of the biographies that used to appear in the back of the Harmony line of products, right? There'd be the analysis for the first 80 pages, and then there'd be 20 pages of addendum in the back that would have things like bios of the individual extremists that appeared in the Harmony write-ups. So I was doing a little bit of hourly consulting work there, and then went to an Army football tailgate and bumped into Clint Watts. And Clint was sort of cycling out of the Combating Terrorism Center and looked at me as a former Army guy, someone who's working at a government bureaucracy and cared about the topic. And he said, well, this guy could be a placeholder to basically take this emergent program that Clint had started with the number 3 at the FBI at the time, TJ Harrington, and just keep the program running. The program really was world class. We had a stable of subject matter experts, many of whom were PhD students or had recently graduated with their PhD. So they were on the front, the cutting edge of the research into global jihadism at the time. And I think it's very telling that we went to, young scholars to get to the cutting edge more so than more well-established scholars. Because again, this just wasn't a topic of tremendous interest in the academic field broadly. And I just sponged off them, for the first year or two. I was also surrounded by the staff at the Combating Terrorism Center, yourself and others who were doing really incredible work, synthesizing the scholarship and then doing, original scholarship on a lot of the documents that were in the Harmony database. The Harmony database was a DIA administered database that had captured all the battlefield documents from the war on terror. So a laptop, a thumb drive, a pocket litter, a letter that had been written between an Al-Qaeda senior leader and another, all of that found its way into the Harmony database. Special Operations Command created a relationship with West Point's Combating Terrorism Center to declassify portions of that and then let the CTC analyze it. So on the one hand, I had this first-person view into Al-Qaeda's internal correspondence. And on the other hand, I was surrounded by all these brilliant other scholars studying related issues from across the country. And then on the third, I was surrounded by, today the Joint Special Operations University students, and tomorrow FBI special agents, and the day after that CIA University, and the day after that the Foreign Service Institute students at State Department. So I had this incredible perch to look into the academic community, but also into the professional counterterrorism community across the interagency. And you can't replicate that education, right? So for 5 years, I got to sort of sit on the nexus between theory and practice, or research and practice. And I just soaked up as much as I could, and really fell in love with teaching, fell in love with translating research into practice for real people with real jobs. It was just a life-changing 5-year experience, and I'm incredibly grateful for it, and don't know exactly how to replicate that, for the next person.
Yeah. Well, working with you during those years was a highlight of my career as well. Definitely enjoyed that. Want to talk a little bit about you becoming the executive director of the world famous START Center in 2012, the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism. There you led a variety of research projects. You've testified before Congress on several occasions, and of course managed a variety of people and their own research projects. Any fond memories that you'd like to share about your experiences there at START?
Yeah, I mean, almost nothing but fond memories, right? Of course, that you have your moments, but it was, again, an incredible privilege. I came to START as the executive director, which in START's parlance was the number 2. The director was the founding director, Gary Lafree, an esteemed criminologist. And, Gary was just a delight to work with, incredible work ethic, but incredibly calm and Midwestern nice. So it was just a great culture in the organization. In addition to the Gary Lafrees, these sort of calming presences of the world, you had the Gary Ackermans of the world, the mad scientists who pushed everybody to think differently and faster. And then, just incredible methodologists, scholars like Aaron Miller, who led the Global Terrorism Database project, incredibly ably for a very long time. Later, Mike Jensen, who joined the organization, is currently their research director and led a lot of the really cutting edge data sets on individual level behavior. So the PIRIS data set, and then its companion, the BIAS data set, which looks at perpetrators of violent extremism and hate crime, respectively. Amy Pate, who became my executive director when I took Gary's role as director. And she, of course, is now serving as the director at START. So just incredible scholars. I could go on and on about the people. It was very difficult and remains, unfortunately, very difficult to sustain those data sets. This is one of the real cruelties of the soft-funded research world, is that you have a product like the Global Terrorism Database, which became the gold standard for incident-level data internationally, the most widely cited tool in all of terrorism studies. Every undergrad paper, every master's degree paper, most PhD papers, will have citations to the Global Terrorism Database. But it was exacting and expensive and labor intensive. And after a government entity, funded it for a couple of years, they were like, "Well, we've already funded that. We don't really need to keep funding it going forward." And of course we do, because the terrorism isn't stopping. It's continuing to evolve, and we need to continue to track these trends. So on the one hand, it was this really bittersweet learning process that even when you create the most, and again, this is not me doing it, but even when your team is creating some of the most valuable resources in all of terrorism studies in all of the world, it doesn't mean you're going to have consistent funding and the ability to keep producing that work. And so that was quite an education, and I certainly made a lot of mistakes along the way, that I've learned from. One of the things that I want to highlight, though, because it I think helps explain at least the field's trajectory and my personal trajectory, is that along the way, not only was START generating a lot of the data sets that it's very well known for, but around 2013, 2014, DHS Science and Technology started to fund researchers to look at prevention of terrorism, not just the threat, but how do we prevent the threat from happening? Now, that might sound kind of silly, like there's always been counterterrorism research. I would argue that there's been very little counterterrorism research compared to the percentage of government grants and contracts dedicated towards understanding threat. Right? The majority of funding goes to threat because it's frankly much more comfortable for the government to fund researchers to study them as opposed to fund researchers to study the government and how it's responding. So there was some counterterrorism work. It was a part of START's portfolio, but not as much as there should have been. But this was something different. DHS Science and Technology started funding scholars that had a background in other domains like public health. These were clinical psychologists like Steve Wine, who had been doing, AIDS prevention work overseas, or gender-based violence prevention work. These were scholars at the Chan School at Harvard, public health school at Harvard, who might have been looking at youth suicide issues or health issues. And we didn't call it a public health approach, but we started to consider, what if we take what we've learned from other disciplines and applied it to terrorism prevention? Is there something there? And for our non-US readers, they might say, well done, United States. It took you long enough because there are other countries that have been, doing this for a much longer period of time. But it was really innovative in the US context to start looking at what mental health providers, educators, other public health officials might know about violence prevention of other forms of violence: suicide, gender-based violence, intimate partner violence, violence against children, community-based violence, and start to redomain that to this exotic form of violence called terrorism. And I started working with Steve Wine and others. Steve, Heidi Ellis, there are other people who really led this charge, but I was able to support them on some project-specific work. And it totally changed my focus from terrorism studies to counterterrorism to terrorism prevention as a unique and different area. And I can't explain how I think important this is, that it was the R&D enterprise at DHS, which started to make investments in 2014, which didn't materialize into policy changes on paper until about 2021, but really in earnest until 2022, 2023, where we really, at the Department of Homeland Security Center for Prevention Programs and Partnerships, really started to implement a public health informed approach in earnest and saw the fairly remarkable return on investment there. So it just gives you a sense of the lead time for that research to practice pipeline. And as an individual, having been at START, I remember DHS Science and Technology encouraging us at START to go take what's called an IPA, interpersonnel agreement contract, to go into government for 2 years. It's a vehicle that the government has to bring in academics or private sector folks into government for 2 to 4 years. And I kept saying, no, this is what we're doing here at START is so important. And frankly, our funding was really, really dicey, and I was afraid to sort of take my hands off the wheel there. But eventually I got an opportunity, a phone call asking if I would come run this terrorism prevention office at DHS. And I thought, my God, this is a chance to take 10 years of thinking and start to put it into practice. Again, one of those really, really fortunate idiosyncratic moments in my personal story, where I got to take research and turn it into practice in a very real way. And again, that has just been so gratifying, starting with the CTC at West Point. So that story sort of repeated itself, but in a slightly different way with DHS.
Yeah, so you were the director of this center there. What were some of the overall goals and objectives that you were trying to achieve? And looking back now, in hindsight, what were some of the challenges you encountered? Some successes that you maybe have been celebrating?
To be very candid, it was a job that not a lot of people wanted. It was fraught in the sense that there were not very quiet murmurs on Capitol Hill from Congress about potentially defunding the program. There was risk aversion within the administration because there were some critics on the left who didn't like earlier manifestations of terrorism prevention. So what we used to refer to as CVE, or countering violent extremism, because of its unintended second-order effects, stigmatizing and stereotyping Muslim and Arab communities in the United States. So there's all sorts of baggage on the left and the right, and a fairly small and under-resourced office. But again, it was an opportunity to do something that I thought really mattered. And when I showed up, the acting director, Jenny Presswalla, basically handed me a draft strategy and said, I think this is what it really means to do a public health informed approach to terrorism prevention. Again, on paper, CP3 had that strategy since the creation of this office at the start of the Biden administration. I'm making hand gestures because there had been previous incarnations of this office under different names. But in 2021, the Biden administration announced that they would take a public health informed approach. And Jenny basically, I think, with some colleagues at CP3, spent some time figuring out what would that really mean in practice, handed me a draft and said, I think this is what we should do. and I was completely on board. So Jenny is the architect of this strategy with lots of support from others, but I want to give her credit. And once she handed it to me, we then spent as an office the next 6 to 12 months like logic modeling the hell out of that thing, theory of changing everything that we had on paper and distilling it from what is our overall theory of change to what are our strategic objectives and the theory of change and logic model for each of those objectives. And how do we break that down to the individual level performance plan of every employee? So that when you go to work that day and you look at your performance plan and then you go act on that performance plan, your behaviors are nested to the objective, to the strategy. But we took 6 to 12 months to internalize what does this really mean for the Department of Homeland Security, which is a security organization. It's not uniquely a law enforcement organization, meaning that there are lots of parts of the DHS enterprise that don't do law enforcement, right? FEMA is a massive example of a non-law enforcement role that DHS plays. But DHS is also the largest law enforcement organization or employer in the United States. So how do we take the largest law enforcement employer in the United States, which is inexorably tied to perceptions of security, and turn it into a public health informed prevention office that is looking to intervene before someone engages in criminality, meaning how do we avoid the punitive criminal justice outcome by instead leveraging 30 to 40 years of research and practice from the public health community for things like suicide or intimate partner violence prevention. So this is not a small cultural shift, not just for ourselves, right, within CP3, but all of our partners around the country, right? We had great relationships with the public safety officials across the country, lots of law enforcement organizations. We were natural partners for them. Now we were reaching out to mental health providers and behavioral health specialists and clinical social workers and saying, this exotic problem that for 20 years we've said is national security, homeland security business, we actually think it's your business too. We think this is mental health business and social work business. We think this is school counselor business. We think this is workplace HR business. Because what we're really trying to do is address underlying risk factors in people's lives before they ever manifest as a hate crime, an act of terrorism, or a school shooting. And to do that, we've got to get there early and with a multidisciplinary team of people who can build the protective factors in that person's life, which crowds out risk to vulnerabilities. And on the one hand, maybe it sounds commonsensical. On the other hand, it was incredibly rigorous, thought-provoking work to be a part of as a part of this team at CP3. And, I will say, of course, with heavy bias, it was working really well. Let me give you just a couple metrics. Despite being the Department of Homeland Security, with some of the baggage that brings with it to certain communities, if you look at our grant program and the applications for the Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention Grant Program, yes, between the last 2 years that the program ran, the number of law enforcement organizations applying for the grant doubled. So we didn't lose our trusted relationship with the public safety community, but the number of public health organizations increased 1,000-fold. The number of underserved communities, communities that would normally be distrustful of Department of Homeland Security efforts, because in the past they have sometimes, securitized approaches have sometimes overly negatively influenced minority communities in the United States. The number of applicants from those underserved communities increased massively. And what that means is we were winning trust across the board. We weren't losing trust in any of those three categories. We were gaining trust. And I think the part of the reason we were gaining trust is because we meant it when we said we were taking a public health informed approach. We hired clinical social workers. We hired trauma-informed child counselors from inner city school districts. We hired medical doctors, primary care physicians. We hired epidemiologists who had worked in violence epidemiology at the state level. We worked we hired individuals who had built state-level public health informed strategies to violence prevention as policy people. And so we really created this interdisciplinary team that included public safety and public health individuals. And as a result, we were much better able to communicate with and partner with state and local counterparts in government and in NGOs. And I could go on and on about, I think, some of the successes, but the challenges were real. And at the same time, the progress was incredibly validating and inspiring, frankly. Maybe if I can, sorry, I've been talking a long time, James, but let me give you one more just outcome. And this is available in the Congressional Report to Congress that CP3 published, because we really made a huge effort to be more transparent and publish everything we could about what our grantees were doing and what we were doing, all of the measurement and evaluation of our program. We funded 17 organizations, or 17 grants to organizations over a 4-year period to advance behavioral threat assessment and management capability at the local level. These are multidisciplinary teams that intervene when someone exhibits behavioral indicators associated with violence. So they start to fixate on the Columbine attackers. They make general statements about starting a racial holy war. They assault a student, and in the disciplinary action say that they're going to come back later with a gun. These are serious behavioral indicators, often verbal threats. With those 17 grants totaling $8.1 million, we funded 1,172 individual level interventions. And in 93.5% of those instances, the individuals got access to help. They got a mental health professional, a social worker, they got coping skills through a counselor, job training programs. 93.5% of those individuals got help and were not incarcerated or investigated. 6.5% of those instances did result in a criminal justice investigation because a crime had been committed already, or there was an imminent threat to public safety. Meaning that by blending public health and public safety, we really did balance out the ability to get people help early while also maintaining that public safety net. And the ROI on that is staggering. Now, we don't know how many acts of violence were stopped, right? We'll never know that. But using a lot of data and analysis from RAND, I can tell you that an average investigation costs $20,000 to $40,000. An average prosecution costs $80,000. An incarceration costs up to $3.5 million if it's a 15-year incarceration. So the criminal justice costs averted here are in the nearly $200 million. Even if only 5% of those interventions prevented a criminal justice intervention, right? So even if 5% of those 1,200 cases stopped the criminal justice outcome from needing to be done, we are hundreds of millions of dollars in the black. If 0.1% of them stop the mass casualty attack, those can cost between $100 and $500 million in terms of cost to society, not to mention the lives lost. And so $8.1 million or $6,900 per intervention, and the likely cost savings in lives and money is orders and orders of magnitude bigger than that. So really couldn't be any prouder of the work that we did, and more devastated, frankly, by its dismantlement that's going on right now, because unfortunately CP3 will not be doing terrorism and targeted violence prevention going forward in the way it has done over the last several years.
Yeah, it does seem like a real travesty, especially with that return on investment that you mentioned. You also mentioned that there was some state level programs that you were either partnering with or what. If there was like one state that you can think of that was really doing it well, really doing it right, what would that state be?
The really cool thing about our federal system is that states can tailor programs based on their own needs, their own constituencies, their own strengths, their own vulnerabilities. So there's a couple of really exemplar states that I can highlight, and there's some of our early adopters. New York State, unbelievable. After the Tops supermarket tragedy, which is tomorrow, I believe, in terms of the anniversary of that, May 14th. We should fact check that and make sure I'm not getting that wrong. But They took some work that we had funded there in the years immediately prior. They took it off the shelf and they invested in it. And so now there are behavioral threat assessment and management teams. We had funded the pilot in Rochester County. There are now teams in every county in New York State. They looked at our grant program. They said, okay, we're going to create a $10 million grant pool for these county teams to access in order to make sure that they have the initial, the capital to get these teams up and running and trained, and then to come to an annual convening to share lessons learned. So New York State has completely taken ownership of this and is doing incredibly impressive work in secondary prevention specifically, which is those individual level interventions. Hawaii is doing incredible work. They generated a state strategy, and then they went a step further, generated an implementation strategy. Also very strong in secondary prevention, but with more a focus on primary prevention as well, sort of more upstream programming. Illinois was an early adopter, involved a lot of sort of different resources like public health professionals in ways that it was fairly novel at the time. But James, there are 8 states that have a strategy now, in large part because CP3 helped them get to that strategy. There's another 8 states that are currently drafting a strategy. So we'll have 16 if they're allowed to, if they're able to continue. And then there were 27 states behind those 16 who were in line to work with us at CP3. So if we could somehow figure out how, absent CP3 in the out years, to get those 27 states over the finish line, there will be 42 states plus Washington, D.C. with a state level strategy, meaning resources and attention dedicated to prevention. That's game changing. And so, even if CP3 doesn't continue to do that work, at PERIL, and I hope others are looking at ways to take those 27 other states and help them continue to do this work and move the locus from the federal government to state and locals.
Well, that sounds very promising. Now you're executive director at PERIL, so do you foresee, some of those kind of programs being a new priority for PERIL?
We are talking to funders every chance we get to see if we can secure funding to pick some of that low-hanging fruit. Meaning, unfortunately, right now, there's incredible human capital, people who have dedicated their lives to doing this work, who are looking for jobs. And if we don't move quickly, they're going to find jobs elsewhere. Potentially not in the prevention field, because again, CP3 was such an important seed funder for organizations to do this work around the country, as well as an employer in and of itself. So PERIL has a pilot program that's just wrapping up now. We call it the CARE model. And this has to do with providing communities assistance and resources at the local level. And it's really an NGO version attached to a research center, but an NGO version of what CP3 was doing at the federal level. Meaning CP3's field staff they were convening locals, they were bringing technical assistance, and they were helping them with the strategy process in schools or at the state level, right, and everything in between. So we have the ability to absorb a lot of that human capital and deploy them around the country to keep the work going, but also powered by PERIL's research and novel interventions. And so I think this has a lot of promise. I loved CP3. I loved my time there, and the team was incredible, but it's challenging to work in a government bureaucracy around dicey issues, right? So there were some things that were very difficult to do from a government perch that I think PERIL would actually be a little bit more nimble and flexible at doing. So in no way am I okay with what's happening at the federal level in terms of CP3, but perhaps there's a silver lining here that if we can secure resources, there might be some things we can do, faster and as effectively, in part because of the research that we have here at the lab.
Okay, let me follow up on that real quick. The PERIL describes itself on its website as an applied research lab. So what does that exactly mean? So
PERIL is a relatively unique research center in that the goal is to test every intervention that we do in a lab setting to ensure that when this intervention is conducted out in the public, it will do no harm. So whether that's the creation of an online pre-bunking video that gives viewers a microdose of some sort of manipulative violent content, and then allows them to come to their own conclusions that manipulation is a negative thing, so that when they come across similar content in the wild, they have antibodies to it, and they're more likely to realize that they're being manipulated. They feel disgust, they feel anger, and they reject it. So we test all of those kinds of pre-bunking or inoculation videos in the lab, but then we field test them. And then once we field test them, then we scale them to a broader audience. And that is incredibly valuable. If you are utilizing a PERIL intervention, it has been tested rigorously. And if there was any blowback to that intervention, we didn't release it into the wild, or we don't set it into the public. And so that's just a fairly rare standard that I think I'm very proud of when it comes to joining the PERIL team. But it's also true for our in-person interventions. So if our training team comes and provides training on misogyny, violent misogyny, and the issues around violent misogyny as it relates to other forms of violent extremism, we've tested those curricula in small settings, in a larger test, and then now it's coming to your school or your university. So we really, I think that is the magic and the secret sauce behind PERIL's interventions is the degree of rigor and testing associated with them. And it's not that we don't look at threat. The process starts with an understanding of the threat landscape, especially the narrative landscape. So we have an incredible team of code bookers who are looking at the manosphere, or who are looking at accelerationist narratives online, who are looking at anti-Semitic locales online, and identifying those emergent narratives, which are at risk of going from the darkest corners to TikTok or Instagram, where they're going to meet a much broader audience. So we're constantly monitoring the narrative landscape for emerging threats, but that's the start of the process. The rest of the research process is on the intervention, right? And this is an important, I think, a really important differentiator. Most research centers are just, they start and end with the threat. And while that's good and right, at the end of the day, unless we're studying ourselves, how can we actually mitigate risk? We're not going to get better at this over time. But PERIL is getting better over time at these online and in-person interventions, because that's the subject of a lot of our research. And that to me is really promising and exciting. So I think that would be probably the largest differentiator. The goal now is to go from proof of concept to national level impact. And that's a scale and resource issue. But certainly a surmountable one if we have the funding.
So in 10 years' time, if you're looking back at the successes that PERIL has accomplished, what do you hope that you'll see?
Yeah, two things. The first is that as an organization, PERIL will be more than a constellation of awesome people and awesome projects, but PERIL will in essence be a repeatable process, or an engine of interventions, research-based interventions, that is much more than the sum of the individual projects. So right now, we find a funder who's interested in anti-Semitism. We crank up the anti-Semitism research and development engine, and 6 months later, we've got an intervention out in the field. That's good, but wouldn't it be better if we didn't have to crank up the engine once we had a funder, if we had the ability to be monitoring across all of these narratives all in real time, and then just getting faster and faster about moving that rigorous tested intervention out to the real world. And that's going to take unrestricted funds. It's going to take just a different business model. But if we can do that, we can make a real difference, because the interventions are statistically significant in their outcome. But we have to get outside of this project-based world and into this is one large muscle movement that we just keep repeating across the range of different extremist threats. So that would be one, is going to that bigger engine of R&D. And the second would be seeding human capital across the country who could take peril interventions and other great work that's being done by other organizations and deliver them across the country at a national scale. So if the CARE model is in 50 states and our CARE staff are bringing this increasing volume of interventions to state and local partners in real time, that would be the second. And part of that, we would like to create a credentialing program here at American. So we're bringing in people who want to come here to study with us, intern with us on the research projects, but then get placed out in the field to do the work. So not only does the research become a research to action lab, but our educational pipeline becomes an education to action lab informed by all that research. This, to me, would be really transformative to be able to seed people who have this background from an education and a research standpoint in their arsenal as they go out and work at Walmart or at United Healthcare or at state of Arizona government or at local public health, county office, sort of to populate the country with individuals who take a public health approach to this form of violence prevention. Because at the end of the day, I think what we're talking about is normalizing prevention for targeted violence and terrorism, and that's going to take bodies. It's going to take people
and lots of time, as you
and time.
Yeah.
But James, if you think about we do see change in our lifetime. Think about the difference between when you and I were kids and the way suicide was treated and talked about, which is to say it wasn't. You didn't say, Bill, are you okay? Are you thinking about hurting yourself? You shied away from those questions, afraid you might push Bill over the edge. We know better now, right? And now there's a norm around suicide prevention. And I'm not saying it's perfect or that it's a silver bullet, but it's certainly, if Americans understand that targeted violence and terrorism are preventable, which it is, they will be more likely to take part in that prevention. And that to me is incredibly important given the volume of violence that we're facing right now.
Yeah, it sounds like you really got your work cut out for you, but it's fascinating work. It's good. We're almost at the end of our time already. Just a few more questions, if you don't mind. I'd like to ask you, first of all, throughout your career, you've had several leadership positions in the military, in academic settings, in a federal government bureaucracy. Could you share some lessons you've learned about successful leadership?
Well, learn from your mistakes. I've made many. Surround yourself by smarter people than you, and then try to listen as much as you can. Maybe that those are cliche, but I mean, I'm really serious, especially about that latter piece, is that, join great organizations and don't be afraid that your subordinates are smarter than you are put them in a position where they can lead the organization if that's the thing that they're great at. It's conceivable that you or I have worked with individuals in our past who, instead of empowering their individuals, might have seen them as a threat or something like that, and kept them back instead of putting them forward. So that's another. I have a couple of rules of thumb. Reputation is everything is the first. Reputation is everything. It's everything. So if you show up every day and you do a good job, if when a funder gives you funding, you meet your deliverable deadlines and you do the best work possible, that begets success, right? And so the second you stop making sure that your reputation is bulletproof, right? It's either a virtuous cycle or a death spiral professionally, I think. So reputation is everything. And that is useful because it gives you the ability to take a step back from the moment and make the best decision, I think, longer term, based on your values and what is actually right. And I'm not saying I've done this every time, but there have been a couple of very difficult decisions I've made in my career where I think it helped that I had a slightly different, longer term perspective about what I'm really about and what my organization was really trying to do. When I mean reputation, I don't mean superficially. I mean, like, how will you be remembered? How do people speak of you when you're in rooms you're not in? Those sorts of things. And then maybe more operationally, although it'll sound conceptual, get bigger than the problem. I think oftentimes leaders and organizations confront a problem and they get just as small as that problem is. They meet the problem where it is on the problem's terms and try to solve the problem within those parameters. And I think oftentimes, if you're leading a complex organization that's doing difficult things, you have to change the parameters of the problem sometimes. Sometimes you have to get bigger than the problem. Sometimes a solution will never appear within those left and right limits, but the solution will appear right outside of those limits. And it's a hard thing to put my finger on like concrete examples, but I've found over the years where if you could take a step back and not be bound by the problem, but instead inspired or instigated by the problem to think differently and bigger, you often will come to something which is novel to your community or your field. And maybe the public health approach to terrorism prevention is a good example of that. We got really good, not you and I, but we got really good at finding, fixing, finishing, exploiting, and analyzing objectives in the war on terror, right? We could kill the first bad guy on the objective, exploit that objective, and go to the next target faster and faster and faster. And it wasn't winning, right? We got incredibly good at counterterrorism, but it took us to step outside of counterterrorism to think about what does it mean actually to decrease the frequency and volume of violence over time. Maybe it's not about the organization or the individual perpetrator. Maybe it's about broader movement level, variables and characteristics. And so by getting out of the security paradigm and the counterterrorism paradigm and into a broader public health paradigm, all of a sudden now you have primordial prevention, primary prevention, secondary prevention, tertiary prevention, a whole new set of concepts and paradigms to apply, each of which will whittle down the problem, making it smaller and smaller, so that when you do your pointy counterterrorism, you're doing it at a much smaller problem set in terms of numbers and locations. Getting bigger than the problem, getting outside of the bounds of the problem, I think has been really valuable. And I probably owe that to the fact that START was multidisciplinary, meaning as a general rule, START thought about redomaining theory and data from other disciplines to the question at hand. So maybe it's not just criminology, maybe it's sociology and psychology, and how do we pick and choose from all these different places? So maybe that would be my last. Get bigger than the problem.
This is brilliant stuff. This is great. I love it. Another question, from your vantage point of being involved in so many research and education efforts focused on terrorism and preventing terrorism, what do you think will be some of the most important research topics over the next 5 to 10 years, particularly any topics that graduate students and readers of TPV should consider pursuing?
A million great ways to answer that question. I'll be parochial and I'll give you a couple that are near and dear to my heart, not necessarily the most important for the field, because that's a tall order. To go back to what I was suggesting earlier is, if you have the opportunity to study response or prevention versus threat, please help us study, the response and prevention side of the equation. Study us, study how we can minimize the threat and not just the threat. That to me is the biggest imbalance in the portfolio and creates real problems in terms of actual public safety, because we're not necessarily getting better. Of course, in the terrorism field, that's exacerbated because terrorist organizations are clandestine and they lie all the time, and counterterrorism operations are clandestine and classified, and governments lie all the time, generally speaking, around the world. So just studying threat, it's difficult. It's really difficult, but overt prevention programs can be studied. In fact, they can be studied in really, well-established methodological ways that can really advance our ability to do this work better over time. And so that leads me to number 2, which is measurement and evaluation. Not always the sexiest area of research, but the US government is not going to fund measurement and evaluation research going forward to the same degree, and not that it was funding this robustly in the past, but DHS Science and Technology and NIJ, they were trying. To the extent that young scholars can, do measurement and evaluation work as part of their dissertation, and help keep us improving this practice through M&E. Incredibly valuable scholarship, incredibly valuable for the field. And then this will sound very parochial or very small, narrow, but when I was at START, we got funding from S&T to do 4 waves of a panel survey, a nationally representative survey, asking you Americans about their attitudes towards terrorism and counterterrorism. And this public opinion survey was pretty straightforward and also revolutionary in terms of its value. Just understanding public opinion towards these issues, and in my case now, I would say public opinion towards prevention. Right? Do Americans believe that violence is preventable? If they are aware of concerning behaviors, do they know what to do with that information? Who do they trust to tell that information to? What are the barriers to them taking action? Simple stuff. But if we don't have a map with which to navigate the human terrain in which we're trying to roll out programs, like we're gonna navigate off a cliff. We're gonna navigate into a wall. And so just this sort of public opinion about prevention programs, I mean, it's a pretty straightforward ask, but boy, that's really important for every practitioner, every state government, every county government, every mental health provider who's trying to do work in this field would benefit from that kind of mapping of public perception. So I think a couple examples, again, not the sexiest topics, but incredibly pragmatically relevant.
Great. Well, I'm sure the readers will appreciate this. Very helpful. Is there anything else you'd like to tell readers of terrorism and political violence that we haven't already discussed?
Been a pretty good talk, James.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I think that's probably as much as I have to offer.
Covered a lot of terrain. Well, on behalf of all of our colleagues in this field, I sincerely thank you for everything you have done, both for the field of study and for practice, and also just for what you've done for our country. Thank you very much for taking the time for this conversation. And it's, again, great to see you again.
So good to see you, James.